Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, presented to you by the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The views expressed here are those of the individual and do not represent the views of the Combined Arms Center, U.S. Army, or U.S. government.
Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, a U.S. Army Combined Arms Center podcast on emerging doctrine and the Army's vision of warfare. Hello, I'm Captain Stephen McCreary, and welcome to another episode of Breaking Doctrine. With the newest version of FM 390, Tactics, publishing this month, we've produced several episodes of Breaking Doctrine to highlight changes to the Army's tactical language. On today's episode, we will be discussing one of the most challenging maneuver operations, the passage of lines. Chapter 16 of the new FM 390 describes the passage of lines in detail. Joining me today is Colonel Retired Gregory Fontenot, former Director of the United States Army School of Advanced Military Studies, or SAMS, Commander of the Battle Command Training Program, Director of TRADOC's Wargaming Directorate, and the Army's Red Teaming School at the University of Foreign Military Studies. He commanded 234 Armor in 1st ID under 7th Corps and led them in combat during Operations Desert Storm and Desert Shield, and commanded 1st Brigade, 1st Armored Division, the Ready 1st Brigade Combat Team in Bosnia. He is currently a consultant on threat emulation and leadership, and has authored at least 4 books. Isn't that right, Greg?
It is. 4 books exactly, and a chaptered anthology and multiple articles. I am pleased to report that I actually knew Dick Cavazos, and I'm really delighted they named the Fort Hood for him and got rid of the name of a fairly uninspiring Confederate general.
We're also joined by Colonel Retired Mr. Rich Creed, the Director of the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate, or CADD, here at Fortress Leavenworth. But before we're coming to CADD, sir, you've been everything from a tank platoon leader in Germany to an armor company team commander in Bosnia, and from an armor battalion S3 in Iraq to the senior advisor to the Afghan chief of the general staff. And sir, rumor has it that you had some formative experiences working for Greg here. Is that true?
That is very true, and we could spend a whole podcast about my interaction with the Ready First Combat Team Commander in 1996 and 1997, but we're not going to do that today. We'll save that for a future engagement.
Sir, as is tradition, we'll start the show off with Army doctrine. Mr. Creed, I'll defer to you. How would you describe enabling operations?
Okay, so we talk about enabling operations usually to set context for the other types. And so what doctrine says is enabling operations are operations that connect offensive, defensive, or stability operations together. So on their own, they're not necessarily decisive, but they help set conditions for the execution of other types of operations. So it's the things you do to set yourself up to be able to do the things that you're trying to achieve is a way of thinking about it. They're complex enough or complicated enough on their own that they require a specific, deliberate planning effort, or at least a well-developed and understood standard operating procedures. But that's going to be at lower tactical echelons, like, say, battalions and companies. You really need a planning effort and an order for echelons above battalions. Some examples of enabling operations: reconnaissance, security operations, troop movements, particularly large unit movements, reliefs in place, counter mobility, tactical deception, link-up operations, and then what we'll talk about today, which is passages of lines.
Sir, with that, now that we've described roughly what enabling operations are, what exactly is a passage of lines?
All right, so what FM 390 and ADP 390 talks about in terms of a definition: a passage of lines is an operation in which a force moves forward or rearward through another force's combat positions with the intention of moving into or out of contact with the enemy. And so that's out of Joint Pub 318. In layman's terms, it means a stationary force establishes some type of physical lanes so that another moving force can pass through their position.
Thank you, sir. More specifically, what makes a forward passage of lines different from, say, a rearward passage of lines?
Okay, so the difference is kind of in the title, but the context is important. So a forward passage of lines occurs when a unit passes through another unit's positions while moving towards the enemy. right? So you're essentially setting conditions for a movement to contact in some way, shape, or form for the lower tactical echelons of that overall formation. In layman's terms, the stationary force passes or moves through friendly force lines towards enemy forces, typically to conduct an attack or offensive operations. When you talk about a rearward passage, it's exactly what it sounds like. You're passing through another unit's positions while moving away from the enemy. In other words, you're trying to break contact. In layman's terms, the stationary force passes the moving force through their lines away from enemy forces. So in the old days, you would, at the battalion level, you would talk about the screen line, and the cavalry scouts would fall back through as part of a deliberate defense, for example. And ideally, in both cases, the passing unit's operations don't interfere with the stationary unit. Sometimes it's useful to go back and look at old doctrine. So the 100-5 from 1986, which is a pretty well-written document. I believe some people around here had some influence on that. Gregory Fontenot certainly was someone that taught me about it. But it talked about attack and exploitation often begin with a forward passage of lines. And you do that because a unit is probably close to culmination if it's been conducting an attack. And what you want is a fresh unit that has its fuel tanks topped off, full loads of ammunition, and so forth, to move forward and then continue that momentum. So it's about keeping the momentum. It's the 100-5 said that such a passage must be well planned and coordinated to ensure minimum congestion and confusion, right? Congestion and confusion are not supportive of momentum. And then when possible, the passage should be through elements that are not in contact. So you're looking for a quiet place. You're not looking for where the battle is raging if you have a choice, right? So you want some place that gives you a little bit of standoff in terms of immediate direct fire contact in particular.
Now that we're firmly grounded in doctrine, Greg, I'd like you to take me back to February 1991, Operation Desert Storm. You were in command of 234 on the extreme western flank of 1st Infantry Division. Is that correct?
That is correct. That was the westernmost task force, balanced task force, 2-tank, 2-mech.
Okay. Can you describe the 7th Corps area of operations and how 1st Infantry as a whole fit into that?
I can. So if you think about what happened in Kuwait, when the Iraqis took Kuwait, they began to build defensive positions from the Persian Gulf heading west. As they went west, they would refuse the flank, so they would build fortifications, trenches and so forth, oriented west, and then they would bound forward again. Well, by the time they got out to the Wadi al-Batin, they were thinning on the ground. It was December of 1990 by the time they got out there. We arrived in the desert in January, middle of January 1991. The mission of the 7th Corps was to penetrate the Iraqi flot, the Iraqi frontline positions. And these, bear in mind, these are prepared positions. But again, farther to the east, they had more mines and wire and all that. As they went west and their supplies got lower and lower, it thinned out a little bit. So we were not in a position of attacking as deep a fortified position as the Marine Corps did, for example. But at the western end of the Iraqi line was the Iraqi 7th Corps, curiously enough, opposed by U.S. 7th Corps. U.S. 7th Corps consisted of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, the 1st AD, the 3rd AD, the 1st Infantry Division, the 1st Cavalry Division eventually joined us. They were Theater Reserve, but they joined us, and the 1st Armored Division of the United Kingdom Army. So big outfit, 148,000 troops, bigger than the Army of the Potomac. The main effort for Central Command, that's a big main effort because Central Command was an Army group. 3rd U.S. Army had 18th Corps and 7th Corps. And then you had Task Force East, Task Force West, I think it was. They were called Joint Forces, 2 Arab Corps-sized formations, and the Marine Corps' MEF. So this was an Army group operation. The purpose of 7th Corps, task and purpose, if you will, was penetrate, once penetrated, exploit, and then given the opportunity, pursue the enemy to clear the enemy from Kuwait, and to cut off the main force of the enemy that was in Kuwait So it wasn't just destroy the Republican Guard Forces Command. The plan had envisaged stopping the Iraqi army from getting out. In other words, preventing it from escaping. In the end, it wasn't able to do that. 1st Infantry Division's mission was to penetrate, use it by means of a penetration attack, penetrate the Iraqi 7th Corps, conduct a forward passage to the 1st Armored Division, the UK Army, who would then turn east to roll up the flank of the Iraqi army as it headed east. And it would head east until the Iraqi 7th Corps was out of the fight. And that would take it into Kuwait. So I want to come back and mention something that Rich Creed just said. An enabling operation is equivalent to a task in my mind. It's not a mission. You're doing this for some other purpose. Our purpose was to get the 1st ADUK in position to do the job it had, which was to exploit the penetration. And then we were going to be either in Corps Reserve or committed on any number of contingencies. And that's the other thing. This was a deliberate attack. And a deliberate attack in old speak, old 390, since I haven't seen the new 390 yet. The thing that you're trying to do is to create the conditions to go on. So we had planned in depth. It was deliberate because we had A, time, and B, intelligence. In the old days, we said a deliberate attack was characterized either by time or intelligence, so we had both. We got into the desert in the middle of January. My outfit didn't fire a shot till the 17th of February, but the 1st Division fired its first shots on the 29th of January. So the notion of the 86-hour war is bogus. It was not an 86-hour war. To get that done meant that we had to plan beyond the enabling operation, and I'll let it go there. I think that's maybe more than you needed to hear on it.
What was the brigade situation before you went over the berm and began the myth of the 86-hour ground war, the last portion?
So the division mission you've heard about, the division commander, General Tom Rame, had 3 brigades, 1st and 2nd Brigade of the 1st Infantry Division, and the 3rd Brigade of the 2nd Armored Division, which was based in Garlstadt, Germany, forward-based from the 2nd Armored Division. The division was required to penetrate, and to do so, it put together 4 assault task forces that were organized, 2 tank, 2 mech. Each of the 2 brigades had a tank battalion that was pure that would exploit the immediate penetration of the assault task forces. The assault task forces each were responsible for 4 lanes. So there were 16 formal lanes that were going to be deliberately established. By the way, the lanes were marked beginning at 3,000 meters with large plywood signs painted bright red with a large stencil that said A, B, C, D, all the way out till you got 16. Good news is the English, even the Brits can read American English, so A through whatever was adequate. And so that was the first mission that we were to do, was get the enemy forced out of indirect fire of the lanes and establish the lanes. The other piece of that was we were not authorized to move anything through those lanes to support ourselves. So you got the lanes established, then you would make lanes for your own assets to move. But none of our stuff, no soft skin vehicles, no fuel trucks, no nothing. We were prepared to sustain ourselves for up to 3 days if it took that. My concern also was the 7th Iraqi Corps had refused the flank. And so they had a battalion oriented to the west. And I wanted, part of my responsibility was to get that battalion. So I had 6 infantry companies dug in that I was to account for. And that was the situation. We attacked at 5:30 in the morning on the 24th and had to go through about 20 kilometers of what would have been their security zone to get into position for the assault.
So we've crossed line of departure on the 24th. Let's go to 25 February 1991. What's the situation for you and 234 Armor?
The first thing we had at Stand 2, we could finally see something first thing in the morning. It had been a fairly quiet night, but they had very little response. Right after Stand 2, we had a whole bunch of excitement because it turned out we were in a couple of the companies were in the DPICM and Air Force bomblet were all over the place. So we had to get those companies out of there. But mission number one, or rather enabling operation number one, was to support the forward passage of 5th Battalion, 16th Infantry, who were east of us or on our immediate right flank. They were going to pass behind us and then pass through us on our left, almost on our left flank, to Caesar Ridge just to the north of us. And so we managed that early in the morning. 5th and 16th went through and attacked up the flank of the infantry battalion that was up on the ridge above us. And that was executed pretty early in the morning, probably by mid-morning. And then shortly thereafter, the 1st Armored Division, the UK Army, began passing through. It took all that day and until about 3 o'clock the next morning for them to get through. And the reason it took so long is even though that's a 2-brigade division, they had to move all of their artillery, all of their division support, and some of their national support so they could be sustained as they went to the east. So that took a lot longer than Norm Schwarzkopf thought it ought to take. And the reason it took that long was because you're moving, even on 16 lanes, when you think about 6 maneuver battalions, 3 artillery battalions, and all the logistics support of the 1st AD UK, they had something on the order of 3,000 vehicles and 30,000 people. It's a big operation.
So that's funny that because we haven't done big unit movements, bigger than brigades, except in very rare instances, probably since 2003, they put a model together over at CGSC that shows the 1st Infantry Division strung out on Highway 70, and the division movement, and I think they have the raid as a movement to contact, and then maybe it's a deliberate attack. It's about 120 miles long in terms of, it takes up all of Highway 70 from Fort Riley all the way to Kansas City.
Yeah, moving large formations is not as easy as it sounds. And years ago now, Don Holder and his plans officer wrote a thing about how to move a division. And movement is so difficult that even in the 19th century, Clausewitz writes about how to measure the pass time of a column. The immutable fact of life is stuff takes time to move, and it's easy to figure out. So how long is an M1 tank? What is the interval between M1 tanks? Pretty quickly, you got 5 or 6 kilometers of stuff with just a battalion. It's not easy. And I'll tell you, the other thing is deserts look pretty big until you stuff a corps of 148,000 in it. We had almost no room the next day for us to move. So on the 25th, the 26th, when we started moving north, we had to move in a division column of battalions because there was no room for us to move. And when you get into a division column of battalions, you get to the point you made. We started moving at 5:30 in the morning, and the last maneuver battalion to move didn't move till 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So the physics of movement, we see blue arrows on a map, it looks pretty easy. When you're in the blue arrow, it doesn't look so easy.
Well, that's assuming no fog and friction in terms of people making a wrong turn. It's dusty, cloudy, it's dark, drivers fall asleep, people have accidents, stuff breaks down.
And it's not raining or snowing, and everything is perfect. And none of those things happen. And friction, we used to say in the 1st Brigade, remember, we didn't know exactly how, and this may have to be edited out, exactly how you translated Scheiße passiert or the Scheiße es geht weiter, which shit happens, which is friction.
Yeah. Well, I mean...
Or stuff happens, if you prefer.
Well, and I think most people would be okay with the German translation. But I mean, something that doesn't come out in simulation. When you're pucking icons and you're just telling them where to go, they're going to go where you tell them to go. They can pretty much do anything and go, and that friction isn't captured. The human dimension of those types of things and all the things that Murphy's Law, right? That doesn't get captured in there. Nor is it quite as unforgiving when you think about, well, there was a delay, so now I've been idling for this number of hours and I didn't move when I thought, and now I'm out of gas. Or I'm going to be out of gas at a really bad time on the other end of this passage of line.
And you have to practice this. We used to, in the old 1st Division of those days, we were a reforger unit. So we would, every year, there would be a track vehicle convoy route on Interstate 70, and there would be a separate wheel convoy route, so you didn't tie up Interstate 70, both ways for 2 days, so that we could practice that, because when you got to Germany, you were going to be doing it through medieval towns and or the Autobahn, and you had to know what you were doing in order to do that. So, and that applies whether you're in desert, the Arctic, or jungle. Moving's not going to be easy, and the constraints of terrain matter.
Absolutely. Greg, clarification for me. So you knew that you were going to be passing 516 infantry during the first day or so of the operation, correct? It was predetermined that you had a number of lanes to establish.
Yes, and oh, by the way, we passed 134 before the afternoon of the attack. They passed through us because remember we had to push the enemy farther out. So I was the passed unit on the first day and early the second day, and then a third time on the second day, a third time during the operation when the first ADUK came through. So there were multiple passages of line to sustain the attack.
To keep momentum.
To keep the momentum, yeah.
So with that, when you passed 516 on to, I believe it was objective 15 kilo, was that a known objective to begin with, or was
Yes.
that you had made contact
Yes.
and identified? Okay.
We built objectives, we, meaning the brigade and the division, built objectives 30 plus kilometers deep. And then our contingencies, which were contingency operations plan Jeremiah 1, 2, and 3, would take us any number of directions. And I think the one we actually executed was 3, which took us all the way north, and then we turned east at phase line smash. That we didn't manage with objectives. That we managed with waypoints, GPS waypoints, essentially.
With that, Mr. Creed, sir, are there any other methods for planning or initiating an FPOL or passage of lines in general? We've got initiating by an event or initiating by, contact with the enemy. Are there any other reasons that come to mind, sir?
Well, I mean, I always think of passage of lines as conditions-based. I mean, there's some condition, there's a reason why you're doing that. And because so many things can go wrong, and that's not changed. In fact, I think with the way the world works now, with the, we call it the transparent battlefield, but it's harder to hide or deceive. So I think it's not so much that the methods for planning would be different, so much as what we have to plan. We have to plan a little bit differently for different conditions. And those conditions, again, change. I think you have to anticipate things like culmination, right, to maintain momentum, but you don't always necessarily anticipate when that's going to happen. So there's got to be this ability, as Greg talked about, that initial plan's got to have enough detail that you can call an audible, issue a frago, and it's probably going to be VOCO, right? We're going left instead of right, or this task force is now the main effort as opposed to the other, so now the follow-on support or follow-on SUMA mission is going to be on a different axis, perhaps, right? Which may introduce its own level of complexity if you're driving through somebody else's area. I think, though, when you look at Desert Storm, First ID, and 234 in particular, what I think about is what would be different today if we had to do that and you're fighting somebody that's got satellite observation, that has UASs, that can pick up your electromagnetic signature pretty clearly. And so how would you want to conduct something like that? People like to say, well, we would never have that kind of massing. And well, I don't think that's necessarily true. There's been plenty of mass over the last 18 months or so in evidence in Ukraine, right? Because mass still matters. But what do you do to mitigate risk? I mean, I think there are some things. So from a doctrinal standpoint, we used to talk about co-locating command posts. And maybe Greg can talk about how the different echelons were at least had contact teams or something, that there were people standing next to each other on different radio nets talking. We would incur significant risk putting, say, a division TAC, a brigade CP or a brigade TAC, and then all these passing units all in the same spot, right? Even if they couldn't target you with lethal munitions, they could jam everybody at one time. That would probably be a bad idea. So we looked in our doctrine to get away from saying you're always going to do that. You need to take the conditions into account. To me, that's what would be different. So this isn't a playbook. This is a historic example of doing something at scale. And you've got somebody that can talk about it from the core level all the way down to the company team. But what I would ask the listeners to do is, how would you think about doing this when you got a persistent UAS threat, you got satellite observation? You're still going to want to do it in the dark because eyeballs and visual stuff is important. And then how do you practice it? When do you practice it? Because this was something that we used to drill all the time. Every time you did a table 12 at tank gunnery, it was a forward passage of lines, rearward passage of lines, and it was something that was drilled into your head as lieutenants, platoon sergeants, even vehicle commanders. So I don't know what Greg's thoughts.
Well, we first and foremost, things are far different now. We were fighting the D team and maybe the second string of the D team. These were not well-led troops. They had not been well supported. We could operate with impunity because the United States enjoyed air supremacy. They were unable to see what we were doing. So you could get away with some things that I don't think you could get away with now if you were fighting a near-peer competitor. So first and foremost, you're absolutely right. It's a transparent battlefield, and it's liable to be a quiet battlefield too, because if you emanate or radiate, you're going to get eliminated if you're fighting somebody that has their stuff together. We were fortunate in that we did not. However, there are principles that can be applied in any case. Mitigation includes things like signature reduction, which means communicating no more than necessary. We communicated with pyrotechnics. We communicated by constant rehearsal, by having signs 3 kilometers out. Even the Brits can figure that out, right? And then every kilometer until you got to 1,000 meters, and then it was even more frequent. So we had, and the British appreciated that. They were professionals. We rehearsed with them because this was deliberate. So that rehearsal allows you to mitigate things. If something goes wrong and you've rehearsed it, you've also rehearsed contingencies. If you're doing discovery learning in a rehearsal, that's not desirable, but that's a better time to learn it than in execution. You have to do it in training, and we did too. We had 3 Corps in the States mandated friendly targets as part of the target array, and then when you did Table 12, we actually did something we called platoon kills battalion, where you were fighting, a tank platoon would fight a motor rifle battalion advancing at it in doctrinal speed, led by Bradley's doing a rearward passage lines representing the covering force. Did that at the NTC also. The first thing you saw at the NTC would be a rearward passage lines with friendly target array coming in. So you mitigate by training, but you mitigate also by discrete practices, signature reduction, and the rest. Obscuration. We pumped smoke when I put in a blanket because the wind supported. The wind blew from the southeast, so we could put in a smoke blanket for our attack. We didn't blanket the ground when the Brits came through because we pushed the enemy far enough back. We didn't need to do that. It is going to be a lot more difficult, but I think some of the same principles will apply, and those are rehearsal and doctrine and passive and active mitigation.
I think the other, and it's a reminder, right, because culturally our higher echelons above brigade haven't played a day-to-day role in the conduct of operations in real-world things for a while, right? And so there's got to be a certain level of trust that your higher is doing the condition setting for that. So the Corps had a responsibility for setting conditions, right? The General Schwarzkopf's staff, the Joint Staff at the Land Component Command and above levels, right? They were all setting conditions. The Corps is doing stuff for the divisions are doing stuff for the brigades are doing stuff for the battalion. So it's all part and parcel. You can't say that a passage of lines, in this case you could, but I mean it's not a company mission, it's not or task, right? You said task. I think that's an accurate way of putting it. Within the context of a larger operation, it's a series of tasks. But the battalion passage of lines is not a battalion operation. It's the brigade operation. It's part of the division operation, and that integration is something that I think Reforger and other exercises allow people to practice, right? The
confidence that people had in the Corps' ability to execute doctrine was high. I knew Don Holder. When I was a student at SAMS, he was in he was a War College Fellowship. When he went to PCC to take 2nd Cavalry Regiment, I drove him from the airport because I was going to the same PCC. And believe it or not, a battalion commander from Fort Riley had a rental car, but squadron regimental commander 2nd Cav did not. So I knew him. Tom Rame had been the G3 and Chief of Staff at 3rd Armor Division. The guy who was the executive officer of 1st Brigade and commanded headquarters company of 3rd Armor Division when Rame was there. And all those connections that you made at the Staff College, serving together, all of that had imbued, and Reforger had imbued a sense of doctrinal understanding and confidence in the doctrine. And the Army had gone through what I believe is safe to describe as a renaissance after the war in Vietnam, in which was led by junior officers from World War II, relatively junior officers. Westmoreland had been a battalion commander. He really is the guy that kicked that off as Chief of Staff of the Army. Some people will find that hard to believe, but it's true. Bill Depew, who had been a lieutenant and company commander and so forth in World War II, was a big part of that. Paul Gorman, who had enlisted sailor at the end of World War II, was a major part of that. And the younger officers that were junior officers in Vietnam were the guys that taught us that were lieutenants after Vietnam how to fight. Burt Maggart, my brigade commander, was a veteran of Vietnam, as was Tony Marino in the 2nd Brigade. And Maggart and Sullivan had served together in the 1st Brigade. Marino and Rame had served together in 3rd Armor Division. So we had a great deal of confidence in each other. And among the armor battalions, the only guy that had not served in the 37th Armor in Germany at some point was me. The other 3 armor battalion commanders had all served in 1st AD together. I was a 1st ID, 3rd AD guy, not a 1st AD guy. So I was the only one. And I'd gone to the career course with them. Every officer in the battalion command position in 1st Brigade, 1st Armor Division, which was 2 tank, 1 mech, had gone to the FG Officers Advanced Course. So shared experiences, shared doctrine, understanding. National Training Center led to a level, and Reforger led to a level of confidence in the doctrine and each other that I think we will recapture in this Army. The junior officers in this room will make that happen, I believe.
Wow, it's a big expectation, Greg. I appreciate that.
It's
faith.
your Army now. You have to take care of it.
It's a smaller Army, so it should be easy.
It should be a lot easier. It wasn't as hard as back in the bad old days. I can't believe you said that.
Yeah, I know.
With that being said, that reminds me of 2 questions. When you were conducting these passage lines, did you use liaisons at the battalion level? I mean, did you do a ramp to ramp or a face to face with any of the passing forces, or when you were passing later on, did you meet up at a coordination or a contact point to talk about the conduct of the passage?
Yes, we did all of those things. The brigade had a liaison officer from 1st AD UK who joined us before the passage of lines, quite a couple of weeks before, and was with the brigade throughout that. And that similarly, that happened in 2nd Brigade. The division TOC managed the passage. Division TOC, I meant to say Division TAC. Brigadier General Bill Carter. And frankly, meaning the division, organized this as a river crossing operation. We used the same, we even called it bridgehead. I think called it a breachhead line instead of a bridgehead line. We organized it as if you were crossing a river, near side, far side, and all of that. And the tactical command post, jump command post of 1st Armored Division UK Army, co-located with the division TAC. So Bill Carter had the assistant division commander of the 1st AD UK with him. And we had practiced that. We rehearsed that at scale. Everybody was there for a rehearsal, believe it or not. Big deal. So that had been practiced. And NATO, the standard NATO agreements are STANAGs on how to do forward passages of lines. meant that Army doctrine was consistent with NATO, standard NATO agreements. So we knew how to do this, and so did the Brits. Even though they're organized differently than us, we had a common picture of how to do it. And in the case of the British, all of that came to pass. In the case of 5th, 16th, and 134 passing through my lanes, or my unit, we had practiced that numerous times, had done it at the National Training Center. So that was almost SOP. You know, you didn't have to write detailed instructions to do that. And 134, which passed on the attack itself the first day, you know, they knew they were going to go through whatever lanes were open first. And they began their forward passage 7 minutes after the first lane was open. I remember that distinctly. And that all happened very quickly. When we went through 2nd Cavalry Regiment, that was passing through a unit in contact, which is, you know, to paraphrase the Wizard of Oz, a horse of a different color. That was far less well planned because we hadn't planned on doing it. We didn't know that we would have to do it. That happened as a consequence of the things I mentioned before: common doctrine, understanding each other, confidence in each other, respect for the professionalism of other units that you didn't work with routinely. And in the case of 2nd Cavalry Regiment, we actually found the passage point with a green star cluster. You know, that's how you got there. And one of the things you want to remember is in those days, GPS, the 2nd Cav was using LORAN. And LORAN depended on the Iraqis not taking down their transmitters, and they didn't because they needed them too. We used Magellan GPS, which never got you where you were supposed to go, and we could never quite figure that out until we found out after the war that, and I didn't use it because I didn't trust it because it never got me where I was supposed to go. Well, there was an offset that was being put into the Magellan so that you would not get targetable data. So generally, you are circular error probable of 300 meters or more with Magellan. So we said, "What? This doesn't seem right. We should be over there." Well, it was because Magellan had inputted errors, and the reason I mention that is you couldn't find the passage point in the dark unless somebody shot a star cluster, which is what 2nd Cavalry did.
Well, yeah, that leads me to another question. Were there any issues executing a passage alliance with a unit that was outside of your division, like 1st UK or 2ACR? Did everybody know the doctrine? Sounds like yes.
Yes, everybody did know the doctrine.
Was there any confusion that may have been caused by a difference in unit SOPs?
No, there was not.
How many rehearsals did you do?
With 2nd Cavalry, none.
Yeah, but how about with?
We did multiple rehearsals with 1st AD UK, but only one. There was a mounted rehearsal where 1st AD UK passed through everything, but we only had 1 or 2 vehicles to represent our positions. The 1st AD UK was in the back. 1st Infantry Division was up on the flot, so we, on the border berm, so we couldn't bring all the division back there. But there were multiple rehearsals done around a map board, and then a live rehearsal.
So, Greg, you mentioned GPS error. What were the other friction points that you saw during your various passages of lines?
Well, the other big one was maps. We had no maps. So before we went overseas, the assistant, or the Brigade 2, had gone, and bear in mind, maps is not the requirement of the 2 shop, it's a quartermaster supply requirement. But we knew it was going to be tough going getting maps, so he had 1 to 250 maps printed at our Task C, our training aid support. So these look like a Xerox copy of a 1 to 250. Well, in the dark, you put your finger down and you cover up Task Force 234 armor completely. And we had, in a lot of places, we didn't have any maps. So you took a sheet of paper and you put a grid on it. And so you think of a map as a 2-dimensional representation of the Earth's surface. In this case, it's a 2-dimensional representation of where you were in relation to somebody else. So you took a GPS grid, you put it on there, said, ping, I'm there, and you gave me your GPS grid. I had some notion of where you were relative to me, and that was good enough. So the idea that you're going to have assured communications in the 21st century and FBCB2 is going to be working and everything's going to be copacetic and you'll be emailing and chat bot, no, it ain't going to happen. Something will go wrong, and you better be prepared to be flexible. So flexibility in my case meant I operated by a magnetic lensatic compass and an odometer. I do remember that one thing I was supposed to be able to see when we passed through the 2nd Cavalry Regiment was a microwave tower. And I never could find it. Well, I realized later when we went back 2 weeks after the war, the Air Force had brought that thing down in the first couple of nights. So I was looking for should have been obvious, but bear in mind, I was a tired dog face by the day 3 of the war. And if it was on a map, it was supposed to be there. And it wasn't.
It's and I think it's applicable to a passage of lines, but we were talking, there's a big effort right now to modernize our C2 systems and so forth. And over time, as we've had the ability to do this because of technology, you can provide pictures, right? We provide imagery. Instead of a map, and I'm saying belaboring the obvious here, but instead of a map board where you're seeing things and you're taking spot reports in one way, shape, or form, whether it's voice or some other manner in the form of grids, we've kind of gotten accustomed to imagery, whether it's video or just pictures. But what we've been talking about is if we have to account for that transparent battlefield, maybe we need to push some of our expectations of what people can visualize in their heads back 25 years, maybe a little bit, and teach people to be able to do that. Because your parable there about having a blank sheet of paper and having a couple fixed points, but I have a cartoon in my head. I may even have a sketch taped to the hatch, right? Like we used to do. This is the course of action sketch, so that I know if they're here, then I should be over here, right? I should be to their left. I should be slightly behind. I should be slightly in front. And I'm not sure there's any way to teach people how to visualize things in time and space that they can't see, but they can only hear about, and they got to understand the context of what needs to happen versus what's going on right now. That's a very human being kind of thing that I don't think computers can replace. And the only way you can get good at that, and nobody's great at it, but some people, you can pick up that skill. It is a trainable skill, is repetition.
Repetition and I think understanding the underlying principles. It's you can use a calculator, on a computer, but it really helps if you understand how to multiply, divide, and you understand why it's working.
Yes.
If you don't understand why it's working, then and it doesn't work. Do you believe it just because it came in on the internet? I wouldn't. Do you believe it just because you saw it on your FBCB2? I would, until somebody showed me that they could interfere with it, and we know that that's possible. So I think you have to do as you say, but I also think you have to think about it from the perspective of being a human. The point you made a minute ago, atavism. You want to have eye contact. That's why we want the images, and that's why we want live streaming. Well, if that's not possible, maybe you have to, lean over your JLTV hood or whatever and talk to each other at some point. And I don't think that's going to go away.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in agreement. The joke I used to make as a troop commander myself was you can't jam a paper map. A bit glib, but I at least lived and died by the battle board myself, because we can jam our command and control systems. We can have radio interference, but a vehicular runner or a map.
Well, you don't want to abandon the technology, but you don't want to become so reliant on it you can't do without it. As a minimum, if we have the data in our computers and a plotter and some paper, we can print a map. In 1991, to get overhead imagery delivered to a tank company, you had to have it printed on a paper map. And we had overhead imagery that was accurate on the positions of the RGFC and the Jihad Corps, but it had to be delivered on a map. And by the time it was palletized and distributed, the pallet with 7th Corps stuff got to 7th Corps, and the 207th MI Brigade broke it out, and then the quartermaster guys delivered it. Mine got delivered to me, and a guy in a Humvee with a driver going through a tank fight. And that's not really the way you want to do it. Can you imagine old Sergeant Schulte and Specialist John Tabb, who's now Lieutenant Colonel John Tabb, driving through a fight between 4 tank battalions and 3 mechanized infantry battalions and the better part of a division, Jihad Corps Division and RGFC Corps Division? Say, man, what an adventure that is. And oh, by the way, there's B-52 craters out there, and there's JDAMs, there's bomblets from Air Force bombs, CBUs. It was, that's why I didn't want any soft-skinned vehicles with me. But old Mike Schulte and John Tabb brought that thing forward. Gotta love them.
Well, Greg, while I've got you here, can you describe your passage through 2ACR? Was it different being the passing unit rather than the stationary unit?
We passed through the 2nd Cavalry Regiment beginning at 22:30 hours on the 26th of February of 1991. And it would never have come off without the consummate professionalism of Colonel John Holder's regiment, his executive officer, Lieutenant Colonel Steve Robinette, and Cougar 6, Scott Marcy, the late Scott Marcy of 3rd Squadron, 2nd Cavalry Regiment. These guys were first-rate pros. It was really frightening. First of all, we went into Corps Reserve, and we thought we'd be there for a while because, man, we'd been at it constantly since the 17th of February. And instead, after we'd been pulled in there, we hadn't been there an hour or more, had just refueled and all that. And we got this, hey, you move out now to phase line smash. Well, phase line smash was a good hump from us. We had a ways to go, and it was 6 o'clock when we were underway. And we got there literally just in time. The goal was, the task was be there at 22:30 to do the forward passage. And we literally made it just in time. My talk never got co-located with Marcy's talk until after we had passed through. So we had a grid coordinate to go to. And bear in mind, when you put a grid coordinate on a map and say, 1st Brigade, go to that grid coordinate, and you're not advancing in a column. You're advancing 2 up and 1 back, essentially. And Skip Baker was so far back because of the crowd. We were moving by division, column of battalions in the division. There's a long way to go and a short time to get there. We got there literally just in time. I could not go through the designated passage point because the battalion that was leading them, 134, went through an air combat formation. So Combat Diamond, he was spread out 500, 600 meters. So I was at least that far north. I went through in a column because that's what we had agreed to do. But I went through in 2 columns, which they had accepted, so you could reduce the number of, you increase the length, but you reduce the number of people going through at risk. I drove up alongside of Bradley, yelled at the young man down there, gave him the count of how many vehicles were going through, told him to call the squadron. Meanwhile, my battalion TOC was talking to the squadron, but I never could get a hold of him for some reason. I don't know what the problem was. But we went through, and then as we came through, the thing you have to do is transition from column to your tactical formation. And I had decided and issued a frag order to the effect that we would go through, the 2 tank companies would be forward, Delta Company 516 Infantry would echelon left to give us a bit of a refused flank, and Alpha Company 516 would be in Task Force Reserve and would follow the lead, the right flank tank company, which was Bravo Company. And I don't have the time to get into the detail, but we had it arranged so the Bradleys had tanks all the way around them. There were no Bradleys that were going to be exposed since you had, that's where your infantry was. So as we went through, Delta Company 516, following Charlie Company 234, had to turn to the north to expand. So now we've come from the south, we've turned east or right in our perception. That meant the 2 left flank companies had to go to the north to get out and spread out. Well, when they did that, they went over an intervisibility line, and I couldn't see them anymore. So I called them and said, hey, where are you? Because they should have reappeared. Well, they were still heading north. And Bob Burns, the company commander, so let me sort this out. His loader got off the tank, got out of compasses. Oh, God knows we are in fact still heading. We are heading north. And so for them to reorient, they either had to turn right or east, and they could see Iraqi vehicles, so they didn't want to do that, or they would have to turn in a circle. So, oh my God, now the CAV will kill us all. So I've stopped the task force so that these guys could make a circle and had my TOC call the CAV and beg them not to kill us. And the cavalry watched this pirouette. They must think, what are these guys doing? Well, you remember the Scheiße es geht weiter? Old Clausewitz said, stuff happens, and you got to find a way to get through it. So now we get them coming around. Now we're going to shoot a star cluster. B Company shoots a star cluster to get them oriented on us. And when they did that, the Iraqis shot at the people that shot the star cluster. So Charlie Company calls and says, we need another star cluster. And B Company decides, no, we won't shoot another star cluster. So I said, I'll shoot a star cluster. So Sergeant First Class Harley, my loader / platoon sergeant headquarters tanks, miscounted tape. And instead of shooting, we had, one tape is red, 2 tape is green, 3 tape is white, or whatever, parachute flare. He miscounted the tapes and he fired a parachute flare. So now Headquarters 6-6, 234 Armor is center field Yankee Stadium at a night game. And everybody on the tank is upset. I said to Harley, he's going crazy. He said, everybody be still. They won't see us if we're still. So, which of course is nuts, because they did see us and they shot at us. And they called us for a third star cluster and said, no, you've had all the star clusters you're going to get. You're going to have to find your way home the rest of the way. And they did. It took about 20 minutes to sort that out. Well, why am I telling you this tale? Well, it's semi-entertaining if you weren't there having it happen to you. But it also points out the consummate professionalism of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment. Any one of those Bradley commanders or tank commanders could have made a mistake and done what a lot of units did that night. They shot at things they could see but could not identify. And my dying day, I will remain grateful to Scott Marcy and the superb troopers of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment.
Well, other than that piece of friction, were there any other issues during your passage of lines of 2ACR?
No, and I think that was enough.
Fair enough. Well, Greg, it sounds like 234 was a well-oiled machine during your time in the Gulf. What do you attribute that to?
Superb leadership. 234 Armor was a really good outfit, but it was a good outfit for a number of reasons. First of all, the commanders in that brigade all knew each other and had confidence in each other. Pat Ritter was the only one that was relatively new. Pat took command in the summer of 91. I had been the executive officer of 134. Then I went to the brigade as the Brigade S3. Then I was the brigade executive officer. And then I volunteered to command in Germany, and the Army said, thank you very much for your volunteer effort, but you're going to go right down the street to 234. So I went down the street to 234, where I had been a platoon leader in 71 when it had been called 163 Armor. So I knew that brigade in and out. Skip Baker, who commanded 5th Battalion, 16th Infantry, had been the executive officer of 2nd Brigade, so he knew the division. So Baker comes over and joins the team. Burt Maggart had been the chief of staff of the division, moved up the hill to be the brigade commander of 1st Brigade. So we all knew each other. And as I said, all of us had gone to the Infantry Officers Advanced Course, so we had a common background at the advanced course, and we had all been to CGSC, so we knew the doctrine, we knew each other, and we'd all led troops at the NTC. And when I went as a battalion commander, I had already been as an executive officer in Brigade S3, so I could spell brigade operations, and I had practiced it to the point that we got good at it. I am proud to tell you that we stopped the regiment by ourselves. The regiment came as a 4 detachment, and 234 Armor nailed them, killed them all. Now, the bad news is I didn't have enough survivors to have a pinochle game. And so I told my guys when we got the word that we were going to the desert, that by God, we were going to work hard because I did not want to belong to an outfit that didn't want to have reunions. And I would tell you that from the bottom up and top down, from Division Command and from Fred Franks for that matter, I do not include Norman Schwarzkopf in that group. We had effective leadership that was not going to abuse you, that was going to do their very best to create conditions for success. And that's why I think it worked.
Outstanding. So, you conducted combined arms rehearsals. You conducted rehearsals for passenger lines. What else did 234 do before hostilities began to prepare for going across the berm?
We did, and we practiced, and I'm not going to say rehearsed because we practiced against different objectives multiple times. I had an engineer company, 9th Engineers from Germany, and I had them build Iraqi battalion positions for us, and we would change the conditions. First there would be an anti-tank ditch, and then there would be, firing berms, and then the next time we did it, we would have, a different lay down, but we do that attack day and night using the ACE that we had to fill in trenches. To say there was no reason to believe you had to accept the surrender of these guys once you started the attack. If they wanted to surrender, they need to get a white flag up right now. But you start burying guys in a trench, and they'll pretty quickly decide they want to give up. And so we practiced that day and night, comms on, comms off. We had plenty of iterations. We had about 6 weeks, we estimated, and Tom Rame and General Franks did this. The very first time we practiced mine plows and rollers, Corps Commander was there. I got there my battalion got there on the morning of the 13th of January, got in the desert, and we had a mounted rehearsal the next day, or mounted practice the next day after we had put the plows on and the rollers on. And he was there because he wanted to know. And we learned from that by experimentation, and then we're doing it in the 2nd Brigade as well. And then we would make copies of what we did, formations that we used and what we thought worked, and exchange them with 2nd Brigade. So we iterated that with the 2nd Brigade as well. So we had a communication system that allowed learning to occur while you're training and rehearsing to go to the fight. I'm not sure that fully made sense because I'm looking at eyeballs here. But it seems to me that what we did is we actively learned. And you don't learn unless you apply what you learn. A lesson learned is a lesson collected until you actually change behavior. And so I think what allowed us to do that is multiple iterations, as you pointed out, but they weren't all rehearsals. Some of them were, what would happen if we changed this condition? So you knew what the task was, you knew what the standard was. Only thing I could change and adjust was the condition. We did things like require units to give up, and you have to give me 5 litter cases and 10 walking wounded, so that the surgeon could rehearse. And I do recall we almost had a fist fight in Ploy because the Alpha Company commander, 5th Battalion, 16th Infantry, allowed us how none of his infantry were going to get killed or wounded. But anyway, it led to a confrontation with the battalion surgeon, where the battalion surgeon offered to take this infantry officer, who's obviously too stupid to operate an M16, and go outside and show him what had to be done. But in the end, Greg intervened and told the boys to quit fighting, and we were going to do what the surgeon needed done because his people needed to be trained. I also had a combat lifesaver program. I eventually had 58 combat lifesavers in my tank crews, and I'd give up once a month before we ever went. I'd give up both arms and say, combat lifesaver, come over here, start an IV. You come over here and start an IV on the other arm. A lot of blood got shed, but guys got to learn how to do it. And the very first time I did that, by the way, the guy that did it passed out. He got it done and then passed out cold because he was thinking, I'm hurt. I don't know this guy. He just took command of the battalion, and he wants me to stick a needle in him. Anyway, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
All right.
Hey, you did a lot of all the equipment that you crossed the berm with, that you executed the passenger lines with beforehand. You didn't have all that kit at home station, right?
Didn't have any. We didn't have any mine rollers or mine plows. We got the mine rollers and mine plows on the 14th of January in Iraq. I put them on and practiced with them that day.
Yeah. So everybody was was doing something for the first time. And
Oh,
the sense
yeah.
of urgency, right?
Well, we didn't have GPS.
Right.
You know, we bought that off the shelf from Magellan. We didn't have the mine plows. We didn't have the rollers. We didn't have all the landmines. And all, we had all that crap. It was just there. It is. And this is your first time. We'd never seen service Sabo.
Right.
And we got service Sabo, and you could. The mentality in the Army was you had to zero. Well, the M1 tank was built with a fleet zero capability, and I decided to trust it. So what my plan was, you went in there, if you were a new tank crew, you got 4 rounds. And bear in mind, when we got alerted, I could only man 9 tank crews. So I had 12 tank crews, but there were 3 that weren't manned in the tank platoons, not tank crews. I had only enough people to man 9 tank platoons, so that meant there were 3 tank platoons that were unmanned. Or you unmanned a crew in every platoon. We did it a number of different ways. So when we did that, if you fired, your first round went through the center of mass of the target, you fired a check round and moved off the range. The new platoons got to fire an abbreviated tank gunnery. A tank platoon got, they fired like 4 or 5 rounds. But the point was, you didn't have to zero those tanks. The other thing that was surprising to me is in training, a TPDS round could not be seen. You couldn't see it. It went so fast. Well, the service Sabo round went even faster. But in combat, you could see it just perfectly. You could see it impact on the side of an enemy tank turret, bright white, and then it would cool to orange. Then the T-72 turret would blow off. But you could see all of that. And I understood why that was. It was a temporal distortion that happens because your body's being pumped full of, adrenaline and other hormones that your body creates. And so the problem of seeing a Sabo tracer was a non-problem.
Yeah, but it gets back to some of the questions that Steve asked and some of the points that you made. Because you had a very strong foundation in the different fundamentals, whether they're doctrine or SOPs or trust, mutual trust, shared understanding with people on your left, right, up and down, you could deal with all these other variables.
Yeah.
Whereas if you had to had a P- train organization, right, it would have really been a burden. I mean, it was enough of a burden to field all this new kid and get accustomed to the battlefield conditions or the type of things that you would use. That's a lot easier when you got a highly trained outfit than.
And we did.
And I'm belaboring the obvious here, but I think for the audience, that's an understanding that if you don't have the strong fundamentals, your ability to adapt.
Tank crews have to be able to do what tank crews do. Tank platoons have to be able to quickly. And look, the idea that you can't do this quickly is mistaken. If you have the basic underlying principles under, the basic trinsel. 1-4 Cav formed Alpha Troop. 1-4 Cav was authorized to create that troop because remember we were a split division. So Alpha Troop was allegedly in Germany. Well, it went away one day. And we got the MTO shipped to the United States. That's electrons, paper. And Bob Wilson filled A Troop 1-4 Cav. The last soldiers arrived in the middle of the middle of February, got there. And Alpha Troop 1-4 Cav did just fine because as soon as they got people, they started training. The same thing with us. My last crews arrived after we shipped our tanks. I was getting soldiers as late as Christmas Day. And we deployed, we flew and arrived New Year's Eve. So those kids went into a tank platoon. There was 2 tank platoons that did not exist till we got to the desert. And the other thing we did is we turned in our M1s and drew M1A1s. Well, that's not a big change, but it's enough of a change, especially if you're going to M1A1. We called them Ma and Pa Kettle heavy metal because they had bolted extra armor or actually electrically welded it on. So yeah, but you can be agility comes from faith in each other and underlying the basic training that you had. And then the third part of agility is you got to have the mindset. And I think that division, first division was blue collar.
With everything having been said, what can our units in the field today do to better plan, prepare, and then execute a passage of lines? I'd like to hear from you first, Greg, and then Mr. Creed, if you can follow up.
Well, I believe that we're on the way to that because the National Training Center is back to being a training center as opposed to doing mission rehearsal. That's number one. Number two, you have guys commanding brigades now were junior officers at the very end of the 20th century, commissioned in the late 90s, sometimes in the early, and some of them in the early 2000s. So some of those character traits may have faded, but one of the things I would return to is that physical attributes practice. You know, you do the lane training, then you move your way up. But it sounds a little silly, but I think a three-dimensional map board where you actually move around micro armor. I brought that back into SAMS when I was the director there. It had gone away. I don't know if they do it now, but there's no substitute for laying out a heavy brigade on a piece of ground so that you can see what it looks like, and it ought to be done to scale. One of the other things I did when I was running SAMS, this is a long time ago, so there are better ways of doing it, I'm sure, is we would move all these little micro armor gadgets through a refuel on the move operation. So you understood that logistics doesn't happen by accident. For the officers that grew up with a FOB, where Kellogg, Brown and Root or Halliburton was providing 3 hots and a cot, we need to get back to that. And I think we need to understand that we need to do things that make us miserable too, like field feeding. One of the reasons that we have bad food in the field was so that we don't have all that logistics tail. Army 86 was designed to take the administrative burden out of the battalions. When you looked at how we echeloned in World War II, the field army had administrative and operational requirements. And in those days, we resupplied everybody with supply point distribution. So you had a big infrastructure at the field army level. Corps had none. Corps had no logistics and administrative responsibilities. Divisions did. Well, we've changed that now. We have Corps have logistics responsibilities. We're going to have Corps support groups or expeditionary support formate, whatever you want to call them. You have to figure out what you want your echelons to do and then what you want your formations to look like. And I think once we've settled all that, as the Army goes through this reorganization it's doing now from a brigade-based Army to the division as a unit of action, we'll have to relearn how to do some of that.
Yeah, I think those are very good points. And the only thing I think I would add is a focus on bottom-up, fundamental, basic principles, right? The first thing is there's no maneuver without movement. There's no enabling operation without movement. There's certainly no passage of lines without movement. And if you don't have the movements right, the whole thing, no matter how well planned, if you can't execute, you got a problem. And that's a bottom-up. So it starts with well-trained crews, where drivers know where to go without the vehicle commander saying left, right, left, right, left, right if they've got to talk on 2 nets and so forth. And then you get the platoons. Companies can't move if platoons can't move. Battalions can't move if platoons and companies can't move, and so forth and so on all the way up. And so we've got to trust and we've got to enable our junior company grades to get the time in the turrets, behind the wheels, in whatever platforms that they're using. And if they're a dismounted formation, it's no different. It's the reps to be able to do those kinds of things under the conditions unique to that formation. I think we probably need to suggest, if they don't already exist, things like GTA cards that we used to have. It was part and parcel to every, at least in the organizations I was in, through Ready First Combat Team, that you had a leader book that had checklists for certain kinds of operations. Our passage of lines was one of those that you had the checklist just to remind yourself when you're tired, even if you had to memorize, hey, did I plan for the contact points? Do I know what the nets are that I'm switching back and forth between?
I actually put our checklist in the battalion because I could. in the aviation checklist books.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and we had them in the brigade too, but there's nothing like a checklist. There's a reason pilots use checklists.
Right. Well, you know, we would take the knee boards, we would buy them in clothing sales that the aviators would take, and we would put them on our legs with those checklists, because a lot of times you're sitting in a hatch and you can just flip this thing over, or you could pop down, open it up, and then pop back up, right? And then you talked about it, but the sand table piece, there's something about the way you learn as opposed to watch. When you actually have to physically move things around by hand, and you're looking at things and you're arguing about them or discussing them professionally or both, right? The physical activity of moving those things somehow impresses in your mind, I think, at least for me, the idea that there is a time component to this. And the understanding of time and space is not something that's easily captured in simulation. It's something that you need reps in the real physical world to do. And so things like a passage of lines, a wet gap crossing, any of these types of operations, I think you got to have those things.
Well, gentlemen, are there any saved rounds? Is there anything either of you would like to add before we conclude today?
No, well, you know what? There's one, and it gets to some other things, right? Executing a task at a collective level, no matter what echelon you're talking about, assumes a bunch of things. It assumes that you do maintenance, right? That your vehicles work, that your people can execute. And I think there's a tendency sometimes we pick on a thing, like the wet gap crossing in a warfighter or something. And so that's the big thing we're looking at. And this isn't denigrating anybody's, understanding of how this stuff works. I think everybody gets it. But you got to give the bits and pieces of that larger formation time and space to be able to practice the things that they have to do so that you can do the big thing. And sometimes I don't know whether we have that understanding that General Franks had that, hey, I've never seen a mine plow before. How long does it, what speed does a tank move with a mine plow? It's not 25 kilometers an hour that I'm expecting you to be able to move, right? And so their planning is actually influenced by their knowledge of those little details. And so I think that the details matter.
That's a good point, sir. And with that, I think we'll wrap up today's show. Thank you both for joining me today. I'd like to thank our listeners and note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States Army, the U.S. Training and Doctrine Command, or the Combined Arms Center. I'm Captain Stephen McCreary, and this has been Breaking Doctrine.